Good afternoon and welcome to SIS. It's a pleasure to have you here for our panel on the globalization of hate. My name is Carole Gallaher and I'm the Senior Associate Dean here in SIS. We have an hour today for our panel. I wanted to let you know that we're going to spend the first 45 minutes or so with me asking the panelists questions because they are experts in the area. And then we'll use the last 15 minutes or so for Q&A from the audience via the chat box function. I'm also going to ask that no one record this proceeding because we are recording it and closed captioning it, and it will be available on the SIS YouTube channel very quickly after the end of the event. So let me start by introducing our panelists. Professor Joe Young is a professor in SIS, the School of International Service, and SPA, the School of Public Affairs. He studies the causes and consequences of state and dissident violence. He's published numerous peer-reviewed articles in political science, economics, criminology, and international relations journals. He's been invited to speak to organizations in the defense community and consulted on Department of Defense initiatives focusing on countering violent extremism. His work has been funded by NSF and the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. And his forthcoming book with Aaron Kearns, Tortured Logic, Why Americans Support Torture, is due out in July. Dolan is a PhD candidate in SIS. His dissertation focuses on transnational dynamics of far-right parties and movements in Europe and the United States. During the course of his research, Lucas has held affiliations with the University of Libre de Brussels, the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies, and AU's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. Jaclyn Fox is also a PhD candidate in SIS. Her dissertation research explores the growth and changing dynamics of the far-right movement in the US and across the globe. Specifically, she's investigating why particular areas of the online far-right ecosystem are linked to real-world acts of violence. She's a doctoral fellow also with the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. So thank you all for being here. I want to throw the first question out as a foundational question. I'm going to ask all of you to answer it. Maybe Joe, you can start, and then Jaclyn, you can go, and then Lucas. And it's a simple question, which is, how do you define hate? Is it something that you know when you see it, or do we need to be more precise on how we define it?
Well, thanks for the question. I'm glad that everybody is here to hear us. So that's a good question. And, as scholars, I think we should define things so that we can classify them, and then we put them in similar buckets so that we can explain and understand them. Sometimes folks define these things for political or legal reasons. We saw in the 1990s, for example, a rise in hate crime legislation that defined hate in such a way so that people could be punished for the perpetration of these crimes. But as your question notes, it can be hard to strictly define assault versus an assault that has hate or bias that's associated with it. We saw a stabbing at the University of Maryland. A student was stabbed a few years ago, and it was unclear whether the student was stabbed because that they were a Black man, or was just sort of a disgruntled argument between folks. And so do we call that murder? We just call it a hate crime. The law is much more worried about those sorts of punishments. I'm more worried about defining it in such a way that we can group it with similar acts of violence so that we can understand and explain it. And so most scholars, I think, when they think about hate crime, they think about it as a violent act that's directed at someone based on their belonging in a certain group, which is a little vague, but it's similar to genocide, that this violence is likely not personal, as the victim is often just in the wrong place at the wrong time because it's part of this wrong group. Sometimes folks lump this in with terrorism, though these are really distinct types of violence as well. There is some overlap, but in general, terrorism, the victim of the violence is meant to send a message to a third party or an audience like the government, or to change a policy. Sometimes this happens with hate crimes and there can be overlap, but in hate crimes, more likely the victims of the violence are the audience for it as well.
Thank you. Jaclyn, what do you think?
Making sure I unmute myself. Thank you everyone so much for the opportunity to do this panel and to kind of come together, to SIS and to Carole. Thanks, Joe, as well, for starting us off on a really strong technical base, which I knew you would. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction and kind of talk a little bit about the, kind of the conceptualization, sort of more of the you know it when you feel it. For me, hate kind of comes up when I think about, or when I read statements that deny another person's humanity, that kind of disregard or deny their basic humanity. And we can talk about, dehumanization, which is so linked to genocide, but also de-individuation, where, for instance, instead of seeing a person as an individual with their inner thoughts and inner feelings and self-concept, you see them as just a part of a group, and you see them as representative of this group. So I think for me, kind of hate speech and all of these things sort of flow from that, from the essence of denying another person's humanity. And it can be implicit, it can be explicit, it can be just tossed in some of these forums, or it can be a very specific call for violence. But I think it kind of hinges on that, disregarding another's humanity and that sort of essence of equality and sameness.
Thanks, Jaclyn. Lucas, how do you approach it in your work?
So I'm on a similar page of Joe. So what I would say, first of all, is that hate is not a theoretical or analytical concept that I use in my own research, but that doesn't deny its reality as a phenomenon. So another way that I differ from both Joe and Jaclyn, I think, is that I'm more interested in nonviolent groups and political parties. And so that gets a little bit more complicated, because to call a political party a hate group is a much different proposition. By the same token, many of the groups that I study engage in hateful rhetoric, and I think would be contributing to the same kind of things that we're talking about. I typically talk about the radical and extreme right, which combine nativism, populism, and authoritarianism. And then there's sort of a boundary between the radical and extreme based on whether they use violence and whether they're committed to democratic institutions and procedures. So I think where it ties in is if your definition of who counts as the people and who gets to have full rights to participate in your society excludes people based on your immutable characteristics, that probably counts as hateful, even though that's not sort of the theoretical concept that I use in my research.
Right, thank you. So I want to do a little bit of history now, or get some of our history straight. So Joe, I'd like to ask you a question. What's different about hate groups today as compared to earlier periods in our history, say, for example, during the civil rights struggles, or even in the 1990s, around the time of the Oklahoma City bombing?
I think, well, the US has had hate groups for as long as probably we've been a society, in the same way that I think that's probably true for most countries. So I don't, in some ways, I think the first answer is it's not all that different in some ways. I don't know in terms of sheer numbers if there's more or less groups. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center and ADL, they track these sorts of things if folks are interested. There are issues with trying to do this, right? Because first, if we have more groups, does that mean there's more violence? And, what if they're just larger? So like we know the largest version, the Ku Klux Klan, was during the 1920s, and that version was sort of based in the North. And one could argue that the Reconstruction Klan was probably the most violent, but then, the civil rights version could have been, had more of the spectacular events. So it's hard to know how these kind of more or less of these groups leads to more or less violence. But we definitely have seen changes in the composition of this more general movement over time. I think in the 1990s, this was a time period where skinheads and neo-Nazis tended to be more prominent in the movement. And I'd be interested to hear other folks' perspective on this as well. But I think one thing that's going on right now is that the movement in the extreme right is much more diversified. And I don't think any of us would probably say it's just about, let's say, neo-Nazis or whatever, where at different time periods we might have privileged them as sort of more leaders in the group, in the movement. And so, with that, I think comes more diversity, more demands, more schisms, more to ideologies, where in the 1950s and 60s too, we saw like George Lincoln Rockwell, who was, kind of the head of the American Nazi Party. You saw these kind of well-known national leaders. And then in the 60s civil rights era, again, you saw the rise of the third Klan, essentially. And it was a little bit more unified than I think what we see today.
It does feel really random, I will say. Or a little more random in the sense of like, where do you place groups? The categories seem to be themselves moving around. Lucas, let me ask you a question. I know you know that the globalization of hate is not new, and that the phenomenon of Nazism and its reach during World War II would demonstrate this. But how did the articulation of hate and its global reach change, if at all, after World War II?
Right. So when I think about the globalization of hate, this distinction between radical and extreme that I laid out in my last answer becomes very important, because what you see, at least in the political party level, was that after World War II, the extreme right, as exemplified by Nazism and Italian fascism, became sort of extremely stigmatized and was banished from the political systems in Europe. And with the sort of exception of Italy to some degree, that doesn't mean that hate in those societies went away, but that a certain type of political mobilization became very much stigmatized and had much greater obstacles in the form of state repression and sort of normative opposition in the society than had been the case before. So that created a much different set of challenges for those parties. Pretty soon after that, you see a rebound in the extreme right in terms of transnational networking and an attempt to build kind of a transnational neo-Nazi movement. But it took much longer for a sort of a movement or a set of parties that could try to achieve mainstream acceptability to reemerge and regain momentum. And really important for that was the Nouvelle Droite intellectual movement that emerged in France in the late 60s, which basically tried to move away from biological racism toward a form of cultural racism, which we see pretty much endemic among the radical right and far right parties of today, which basically is this idea of ethno-pluralism, which is we're not racist. We just want all races or ethnic groups to stay in their own part of the world, and that way they'll be able to have their own culture and everyone will be on their own and they'll flourish kind of in isolation. And so that's kind of the rebranding of racism that you see among many of the groups today. And that has now penetrated into mainstream conservatism in many countries, including our own. And that's really the kind of what I see as the biggest change of the last 10 or 20 years, that now you have that as a part of mainstream politics on the right.
So Lucas, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question. How do these groups propose to deal with areas where you have multiple races? And I think right here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, Montgomery County does not have one particular racial or ethnic group that constitutes the majority of the county. So how do these groups propose to grapple with the fact that you've got so many places where groups are all mixed together? Who gets the claim making of, who gets to do the territorial claiming? Is it white people, obviously, I'm guessing?
Yeah, well, I think this is where it starts to fall apart. Not that it has, validity in any regard, but that is much more difficult. And that's where there's a lot more disagreement. You had, of course, famously, no longer really a relevant actor, but Richard Spencer during the last presidential campaign, he talked about the nonviolent genocide, which was basically the idea that you'd create conditions in a society that people would want to leave on their own, or that you would, have some sort of ethnic cleansing that would be not based in actual physical violence, which of course is doesn't hold up. But anyway, I don't think there is really an answer. And I think what you see and what's more relevant to our actual politics is attempts to just increasingly disenfranchise groups and to make it so that our political system just continues to empower the white population and to make sure that they can maintain political control even after the demographic numbers continue to decline.
Rich. So I'm going to move now and talk a little bit about the organization of hate in the US today. And Jaclyn, I want to ask you this question. Some people look at the far right as one big unified bloc, but Joe, you had mentioned this earlier, that it's gotten a lot more diverse. Jaclyn, can you tell us what the key dividing lines are in the far right ecosystem today, based on your research?
Sure, that's such a great and also very, very difficult question to think about.
Sorry.
But it's good though. In the past, a lot of the literature on the far right has focused on typologies. So I'm thinking about Perliger and Sam Jackson, who talk about kind of the racist far right as compared to anti-government, as compared to religious, and sort of those dividing lines. And that, you know, that's still present within the movement. But I think especially with just the explosion of the online far right ecosystem, it's become a lot more dynamic and a lot more amorphous. So what I've been thinking as I've been doing my work is that kind of moving away from a typology and thinking about a Venn diagram, and a Venn diagram where each circle is sort of a different ideological pillar. So we're talking about racism and misogyny, homophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-government, kind of these basic ideological pillars. And sort of then we can look at it as a Venn diagram of where do these overlaps occur. So for instance, instead of a group being one typology type, a group is placed sort of where it converges on these different circles. And what this can then help us do is to understand why certain groups might come together around a particular issue area, but also it can help us sort of maybe predict or think about where the dividing lines and the cleavages will be when these groups come together. So I'm thinking in particular, very recently, there's a lot of talk when anti-government and racist groups sort of want to come together. Racism is a dividing line there. So there are militia groups that say we will not march with white nationalist groups because we are not racist. Similarly, we've seen, you know, homophobia as a dividing line within the far right, where certain elements of the far right, I've seen posts on message boards saying, we used to frequent this forum, but we had to leave because they were not homophobic enough for us. And so you can see kind of these cleavages across different movements. So I think it's interesting to sort of conceptualize it as a Venn diagram with these different pillars. And it's very important to think about the aspects as well of misogyny and of homophobia, which maybe don't get as much discussion in the historical far right.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that. So I know you've done some research looking at the incel movement. I wonder, to the extent that you've seen in your research, to what degree does the incel movement overlap in that Venn diagram way with racist movement?
So my work on the incel movement is more preliminary, and I would definitely direct people to Alex DeBronco. And she started an institute that specifically looks at male supremacism, which is awesome. What I will say, so I've looked at you know, neo-Nazi white supremacist boards where there's some incel kind of infiltration, as well as I've done some look at, for instance, incels.co. That's a more predominantly incel board. So definitely, while saying, you know, you should reach out and check in with this other institute, what I'll say sort of preliminarily is on a neo-Nazi forum, for instance, when Elliot Rodger, who is one of the big incel killers and one of the first, when he's mentioned, the members of this kind of white nationalist neo-Nazi forum actually mock him quite a bit because they see him as not being masculine, not being manly, not being good enough to get a woman on his own. And so he had to go out and kill. So in other more incel areas of this ecosystem, he's very much celebrated and venerated as being this person who sort of took back his masculinity and control. Also on incels.co, there is, you know, racialized language. People talk about curry cells. People talk about different sort of kind of racial ties to incel movements. But I'm not an expert in that, so I would definitely suggest checking out this institute.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you. So Joe, let me turn the question to you now and ask you, based on sort of a 30,000 foot view, who are the targets today of hate groups, or, you know, where's the density of targeting happening?
So I think Lucas and Jackie did a good job talking about some of those. For example, you know, Black folks, immigrants, LGBTQ, Latinx, basically anyone that's seen as non-European, quote unquote, invaders. within the US, women, of course, by the incel movement. There are Black separatists as well, who also target LGBTQ folks and Jews, and sometimes whites. Conspiracy theory plays a big part in this, and a lot of conspiracy theory revolves around Jews. So Jews are generally a group that is just, whatever the group is generally targeting them, whether explicitly, the more modern form of hate that Jackie and Lucas have been talking about. Oftentimes they don't explicitly say it like the 50s and 60s forms did, but there are sort of coded language and dog whistles that let people know that they're still a target.
All right, Lucas, let me ask you a question that follows on from that. What are the key transnational discourses that allow hate groups in the US and Europe, for example, to come together? What's the language that they need to interact? And I know, for example, your research is looking at these ties, so I know you can give us some insight on that.
Right. So there's actually pretty good research on this, at least within my field of study. And Joe is correct that the sort of legacy discourse of exclusion is anti-Semitism. And that was the case for a long time. And it actually was a major barrier to cooperation between European far-right groups, not only amongst themselves, but between working with far-right groups in the US and in Israel, who we know now are important partners for many of those movements and parties. But the big sort of seismic shift that has occurred, in the last 20 years or so, somewhat going before that, is a shift from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia as sort of the master discourse. And that has been a really important factor in bringing together groups in Europe, and then kind of externally into the US and in Israel. And there's actually some good empirical quantitative work on Twitter that looks at basically what tweets get a transnational pickup among far-right actors, not just like what do far-right actors talk about, but what actually gets shared transnationally. And this was a study by Froyo and Ganesh, 2018, and they concluded that Islamophobia is the glue that holds the transnational far-right together. So I think that that's really the most important in terms of building coalitions, at least for that area that I'm interested in. That's not to deny that the other forms of prejudice and exclusion exist, but I think those are more sort of locally based, not as useful for building these kind of transnational connections. But I think as you get more extreme, what I just said holds less. That applies more to the groups that have a greater degree of polity access, that have more ties to the mainstream.
I will say what you're saying, I found that true in my research on the alt-right a couple of years ago, looking at their Twitter feeds. And during this time, President Trump, who they have tended to sort of, support, was talking a lot about Latin American immigrants, mostly Central American migrants at the border. And yet at the time all this was going on the Twitter feeds, they were talking almost exclusively about migrants to Europe. I found it a fascinating thing, because these were all American alt-right people, and they were focused very heavily on Europe. Also, there's a question in the chat box. How do you spell incel? It's INCEL, and that's because it stands for involuntary celibate. Okay, so Jaclyn, let me ask you a question about the orientation of people on the far right, not a political orientation, but a more behavioral orientation. Can you explain the difference between far right groups that embrace so-called right-wing authoritarianism and those that display what some scholars call social dominance orientation? And if you can maybe give us an example too.
Yeah, for sure. So there's been a lot of really interesting research done into the psychological motivation for why an individual would choose to participate in the far right, or would choose to kind of align themselves with the far right politically. And researchers, particularly psychology researchers, have found two different motivations: right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. And what's interesting about these two orientations are that they don't tend to correlate. They don't tend to go together. So if you're high in one, you're probably not high in the other. Altmaier, for instance, wrote a lot of really cool stuff about this. And so kind of an interesting example to think about. Both groups of people might vote on regressive policies regarding gender, but for different reasons. So right-wing authoritarians are motivated by this fear of a dangerous world, the fear of losing the status quo, the fear of change. And so they might exhibit what's called a benevolent sexism. So we like women, but when they're in their home, in their traditional place. Social dominance orientation, on the other hand, really emphasizes this need that certain people feel for their social group to be above other social groups in a hierarchy. So they might vote on policies against women because they believe inherently that women are inferior and they want women to be repressed, and you can be repressed through violence, and violence is suitable for repression because they're lesser than. So these are individual level traits, but I was really interested in how this worked when a bunch of individuals with the same traits sort of came together, and if online fora attracted one motivation more than the other. So I've been looking at Iron March, which is this fascist neo-Nazi forum, which was online from 2011 to 2017, to sort of see if I could map the dominant psychological motivation and if that changed over time. And then if I could expand that outwards to other parts of the far-right ecosystem. And so kind of preliminarily, I do feel like we're seeing a shift from towards the beginning when it was more balanced of RWA and SDO towards the end when it becomes more primarily about SDO. And this is interesting because this could potentially have ramifications for violence and for the kinds of real world violence that individuals might partake in. So if you feel that women are inferior and can be objectified and can be dealt with through violence, you might be violent, and you might be violent in sort of a mass indiscriminate way. And if people are then exposed to more and more of this language, they might change over time as well. So I'm very interested in exploring that. I would say that the one thing that I found that I wasn't necessarily expecting on the basis of this psychological theory was the way in which homophobia increased. And I'm talking specifically about this message board, but homophobia with the psychological literature is attached more to this right-wing authoritarian viewpoint. But it seems to increase over time, at least on this message board, increase at the same time as social dominance views are kind of increasing with regards to gender, immigration, and other issues. And also increase in terms of violence. So not only is it homophobic, but it's we should repress LGBTQ individuals with violence. And that's something that's not really predicted in that psychological literature looking at the motivations. So yeah, I think that answers hopefully.
So I have a follow-up question for you. So if someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, he's of course been deplatformed from all the major places he would have been able to be online, but he was openly gay and he was affiliated very closely with the alt-right, with Richard Spencer. I believe he was photographed in a bar in Texas with him. I don't know if you saw any references to this, you may not have, but I mean, how does someone like that manage to be in the alt-right, for example, or a far-right group and have a voice and survive?
So that's what's really interesting as well about kind of these overlapping circles of where people are able to fall. So I didn't see anything specifically about him in this message board that I was looking at, but there was a period of time when I think the forum called The Right Stuff, when they became openly supportive of the queer community. And at that point, there was a mass exodus from that onto Iron March because they were angered that they weren't homophobic enough. So, different people and different far-right actors, might create schisms within the bigger movement where some people will be able to support because they have other commonalities, but then some won't. So I think that's where it's really interesting to sort of thinking about it as a Venn diagram of where then support is split because of these ideological issue.
Right, right. Well, let me turn to some more contemporary events. And I wanted to ask you, Joe, about the protests going on right now related to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others that have been happening very recently. On Twitter, in the first days of the protests, several people said that white supremacist or white nationalist groups were trying to infiltrate the protest. What do you think about this? Is this true? And also maybe groups on the far left, other people, of course, the president, I believe, was implicated, Antifa as well. So I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on that.
I think this is a really important question. One of the big issues of the day is trying to think about what do these protests look like? And, you know, at one level, so-called Boogaloo boys, which I'll talk about in a second, they're showing up at the protests. Antifa, are they at the protests? Maybe. You know, neither of those groups are driving the protests in the way that we would say they're coordinating with other groups. They're gathering people together. They're leaders in the movement. These are fringe elements who are using the protest to kind of push their own particular agenda. And in some ways too, neither is really a formal group. It's not like they have meetings and they sit around and play cards or something. They're more like Jackie was talking about, like online communities that share some similar feelings about how the world should work. And so, you know, like the Boogaloo Boys, for example, are in general wanting a second civil war. Their name comes from a really bad 80s movie, which Carole and I may know, but maybe not, maybe not the rest of you. Some of those folks are racist. Some of those folks aren't racist, strongly anti-government, libertarian, but they come from a whole lot of different diverse backgrounds in terms of what they think should happen. And so to call them a group in that sort of formal way doesn't make a ton of sense. In the same way, Antifa or Antifa, however we want to say it, it's not really a group. I think what the protests, we all know what the protests are about, at least, you know, police violence, and I think police violence mostly, and then I think a subtext of that is protests against President Trump. And it's fairly diverse coalition of folks. And what's amazing too, as IR people, as IR scholars, is it's caught on globally, right? And in some places in the world, you know, like Brazil, who's had a, you know, we have police violence here, but police violence there is a different thing. And, you know, it's been a huge movement in Brazil, and not surprisingly, they have a similar president as the United States. And so there seem to be similar factors that are motivating folks there. And then I think the really big issue, that this is like the worst time if you're an authoritarian leader hoping not to have mobilization, because you have everybody at home, a lot of people without work, a lot of people without jobs, and even people with jobs are sort of sitting at home waiting to go out and do something. And so you have angry, motivated people with time on their hands, and that's just the perfect recipe for protest.
Yeah, that came up in our earlier talk this morning about democratic decline, that in some ways that the pandemic has just provided a group of protesters. They have little to do but stay at home or go out and protest. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Jaclyn, let me ask you another question about COVID-19. How are the far right groups that you've been looking at online interpreting this? What do they say about it?
Also a very important and timely question too. You know, because of, as we've been talking about, the far right is so vast and so different, we've seen a huge variety in responses, but just kind of a couple of things that I guess surprised me that I wasn't necessarily expecting. I was looking into, at the beginning of COVID, the response by militia groups, in particular the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters. And I was expecting to see concern about potential government intrusion. I was expecting to see a lot of rhetoric on stopping that and of government sort of staying in their lane. And I actually saw the opposite. So, and bearing in mind, this was the way beginning of COVID, but there was an open letter written by kind of the head of the Oath Keepers, who was calling for increased government intervention and who was calling for more regulations by Trump. He felt that Trump was not doing enough, that he should have cut down international air traffic entirely. So there's this really big push in the beginning for kind of increased control by the government. And the 3%ers, you saw it a little bit. They canceled in-person events. They encouraged their members to, have good hygiene and things of that nature to sort of stem the flow. Over time, this changed a lot. And within a few weeks, there was a lot of uncertainty and anger and pushback then against the government. So the Oath Keepers went from saying we need more, and I say the Oath Keepers, but there was actually a schism at the beginning when this open letter came out and other high-ranking members left. So this isn't a unified thing. But through time, they became very suspicious of government intrusion and intervention, and they started staging these anti-lockdown protests and calling on people and calling on members and calling on just any patriots to come out and protest against the government. They also had protests or kind of gatherings in support of businesses that wanted to remain open against lockdown orders. So you saw this very interesting shift, which was surprising to me that it didn't sort of start out there. I think the other thing that was surprising to me were the ways in which, even though the far right is so huge and diverse, there were a lot of parallels in terms of the conspiracy theories accepted and amplified by different segments. So you saw on something like the Daily Stormer, you saw very explicit anti-Semitic rhetoric and conspiracy theories about COVID. In other spaces, it was maybe less explicit, or maybe it was coded, talking about George Soros and George Soros as being behind this. I'm talking about the desire for people to make money in the global elites and the deep state to make money off of vaccination and to use COVID as a way of controlling the population. 5G conspiracies, there was a lot of stuff in that. So I think what was surprising to me as well was just even though the language may have been different and there were implicit and explicit aspects to it, but just the way in which these conspiracies sort of caught on along the whole spectrum, I guess, of the far right in different ways.
I want to ask a quick follow-up question. So you mentioned the deep state, which wouldn't surprise me to hear that coming from militia groups, but it also is interesting when you were talking about Oath Keepers initially were very much like, and the 3%ers were stay at home. So did they somehow take a cue from Trump and change their mind, or do you think they were just worried about the virus and then their ideology kicked back in? And also, what does this mean for if we have second waves? How are they going to respond then?
So that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, for me, just sort of reading it from the outside, I sort of thought that, they wanted more action until that came, and then they felt that their liberties had been taken away. There were some interesting tweets about the government was quick to lock down domestically, but not as quick to shut down international borders. So sort of suggesting that these global elites were protecting their global elite interests to the detriment of the domestic population. So maybe some interplay in there. To some degree, they may have been taking a lead from Trump, but also they were critical of Trump in the beginning when he did not close down borders, and they were critical of Trump later on when they felt that he was suppressing individual liberties. So there was still sort of that line of criticism in different ways. So it's hard to know kind of exactly where. But I think ultimately, once the lockdown really happened and people felt their liberty infringed upon, that may have catalyzed a different kind of response.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to see too if the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers continue to offer security at Trump's rallies. Right? He's going to be starting those again. Because I find that very interesting, just as a side note, that, sort of anti-government forces are defending the government. But you and I, we're working on that together. Let me ask you a question, Lucas. And we were talking about Trump, and so I think this really fits into what I wanted to ask you. Trump is this force, that I think all elements of the right have had to grapple with in some form or fashion. And I'm wondering how far-right political parties in Europe view him. Do they see him as an ally? Do they trust him? What's going on there in regards to Trump, how they view him?
Sure. So, of course, that varies by place and over time. And just like in the US, among Republicans and other, parts of the far right, you see a mix of a distancing while still enabling. You see what seems to be genuine embrace, and then you see sort of opportunism. And so I think that for even some parts of the European far right, Trump is a little bit too crude or uncouth for them, but he serves their interests. He's a lightning rod of attention and for similar ideas to what they have. When I was doing my interviews in 2018 in the European Parliament, a lot of what I was told, I mean, because I was American, I heard a lot of opinions about Trump, and it was some mix of, yeah, we like what he's doing, but we don't really like him as a person, which I think that's obviously what reporters say, that Republicans say, behind the scenes. But of course, also in the European far right, there's still sort of vestiges of anti-Americanism, which were historically rooted in the US being a more racially diverse society, in the idea that the US was sort of like this paragon of capitalism, which of course is tied to anti-Semitism. But overall, I think the most general thing I could say about European far right reception to Trump is that at the very least, he's seen as an opportunity. So in my dissertation, one of the chapters, I look at the way that Fidesz in Hungary and the Freedom Party in Austria sort of tried to cozy up to Trump in the early days after his election, and the ways that he sort of provided legitimacy to these parties that had long been ostracized from official US diplomatic channels and things like that. So like Orban got a state visit after Obama had, never allowed after Obama had never allowed Orban to come to the White House. The FPU had never had really formal relations with the governing parties in the US, but after Trump was elected, there were contacts between Michael Flynn and the FPO. And so it was sort of an opening for a lot of these parties where they hadn't had one before. So even if Trump wasn't a perfect fit for them, he was someone that they wanted to ally with.
So I have a question for all three of you that relates to this topic, and it has to do with, what do you think will happen to the far right when Trump is gone? So if he loses the election in November, or when he's out of office. Joe, do you want to take that? Start with that.
Sure. And I'll reference Latin America first, because we have a longer history of people like Trump being in power, sort of right-wing populists, and what happens when they leave. And generally, populists are destroyers of institutions, and they usually don't have a very good legacy in terms of people following through. And like, if we call this Trumpism 1.0, there's not likely to be a 2.0. My sense is that, there'll be a change in the far right when Trump is gone, but it won't look like what it does now.
How do you think it will look?
I think it will be less powerful. However one feels about Trump, he's been able to establish a very strong base and bring in pretty extreme forces, and they rally around him. I don't think that there's going to be anyone who will follow up that will be as cohesive as a force within the movement.
Mm-hmm. Jaclyn, in your research online, what are you finding in terms of how people view Trump and what you think might happen when he's out of office?
It's a really hard question. I think that I feel like I'm a little more pessimistic than Joe, maybe. And I could see sort of Trump being out of office as maybe ramping up activity by the far right, particularly because, with Trump in office, there's sort of this weird balance of some of these groups saying, we're anti-government, we're anti-deep state, but we're pro-Trump, and we're, sort of within the institution. But I think with him gone, then it could sort of revert back to being a more adversarial movement. And I think that the way in which Trump's presence in office has galvanized these actors and has united these actors, if that continues with him out of the institution, I would worry that there would be more activity and the potential for more violence. I also think that, as I was talking about in terms of the conspiracy theories that we've seen, like those particularly as they're being sort of promoted and retweeted by Trump, I think unifying the base in a way that if he's out of office could then serve to accelerate potentially the types and levels of violence of the far right.
Well, that leads me to a second follow-up question, I think, for all of you. What do you think will happen? What will the far right do if Trump loses the election but refuses to concede? What do you all think that they will do? And again, I realize I'm asking you to prognosticate well into the future. So all of this is asterisked here, but just based on what you're seeing now in terms of activity, how do you think they'll respond? Do you want to go, Lucas, and then maybe
Sure. If I can just quick piggyback on the last question, because I think I actually have more to say about that. What I would say just very quickly is that I think that a bigger problem than just the question of Trump being there or not is to look at the deep penetration of the Republican Party and its radicalization and sort of what's been unleashed there, because it's not just about one person. Obviously that helps, but I just saw today there was a QAnon person who won the Republican primary in Georgia. I don't know, maybe some of you saw this graph that was going around last week that showed, I think Pippa Norris shared it, I don't know if she created it or not, but it showed that the Republican Party was further right on measures of commitment to democratic norms and institutions and ethnic inclusion than most of the far right parties of Europe. It was actually pretty close to the Golden Dawn, which is a neo-Nazi party in Greece. So that's my a little bit more pessimistic again take on like what spells after Trump. Maybe it will be less organized, but we're certainly not going to go back to what we had before. In terms of, I think if what you described happens, there will definitely be street violence, but I don't have a really cohesive answer to this yet. Maybe I should be thinking about it more. I try not to think about it, I guess, but I think there's a real potential for political violence.
Joe, what do you think?
Well, like Lucas, I definitely see a internal conflict within the Republican Party that there are forces fighting for the soul of it. Romney, as people saw, was out protesting with Black Lives Matter protesters, and there are other Republicans who want to keep the general consensus that we've had in the United States post World War II, that the left and right are pretty together on a lot of big issues. Maybe we differ in some pieces. So that I think there's a definitely internal struggle. I definitely believe that the Romneys of the world would concede and say that's what's going to happen, which means the more radical flank may descend, as Lucas is saying, into sporadic violence. But I don't think our institutions, and maybe I'm being too Pollyannish, but I don't think our institutions would succumb to some type of larger collapse, and partially that's because in any of those situations you have to have the military be the first mover, and our military has been pretty stalwart that that's not what they would accept.
Right. Let me open it up to the Q&A now. We have a question from Brandon Sims. Have there been any shifts or trends in willingness of hate groups in the US to use political violence to threaten violence? It seems like more groups are willing to carry weapons to demonstrations. Is that a shift in or meaningful in some way? Jaclyn, you want to start with that?
Sure. I think that, and this is sort of just from what I've seen more anecdotally, I think that the so-called like accelerationists who've become sort of more popular over time, I think they have more of a desire to commit violence and commit random violence as a way to, they talk about ushering in the Civil War, ushering in a race war and things of that nature. And they've definitely been explicit about their willingness to utilize violence for that. You have something along the lines of the 2A protest back in Richmond, so many people were in a very small space carrying weapons, and there wasn't violence, but there had been threats from these more fringe accelerationist groups to bring in violence, and that was stopped. So I think there are elements that are very willing to do that. And I don't think that it's impossible for them to do that, I will say.
We have another question here from Gregory Evans. He says, in the limited research I've done on hate groups, free speech is often cited as a defense of their rhetoric. How do you all think these two concepts affect one another? Lucas, do you want to take this one? And then we can go to Joe and Jaclyn.
Yeah, so usually, I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but I'll just say, I think that's correct, that typically free speech is an important node in their sort of discourse, that it's something that they use to justify what they're doing. Obviously, there's constitutional law related to this. There's a difference between hate speech. There's a difference between threatening violence. But it's actually not something I would say a lot about, other than that free speech is different than like private platforms having to give equal representation. So like, it's not free speech to have equal representation in the New York Times op-ed section. It's not free speech to, be given platforms by universities and other institutions. Free speech is about the government not repressing your ability to voice certain opinions. So I think that's often lost in the discussion.
Joe? Or did I say Jaclyn? I forget who I said would be next. Joe, you can go and then we'll go to Jaclyn. Okay. Sorry.
Well, as universities, free speech is one of the pillars of what we try and do. And so it's something I think we feel extremely dedicated to. And, I think American University, especially, we've had pretty robust discussions of what constitutes free speech and what are the limits of that. I mean, it's clear that hate speech is not protected speech. And so, if groups are advocating violence and differential treatment of different ethnic groups, that's not free speech. And that's, I think, legally we're on good ground there.
I'd just add too, I think we also would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that all of these various protesters walking around with bazookas and AR-15s, they've all been white. And you don't see that happening with African-American protesters. And if it did, I don't think the outcome would be the same. Free speech or not. So it is definitely a rhetorical device.
Yeah, well, and Black Panthers did it in the 60s, right? To much chagrin of folks who thought that was really bad. I mean,
right. And yeah, and now it's the way people react to it. I mean, I used to live in Kentucky, and one of the things that really struck me about the differential treatment of white and Black protesters was a group of, I think it was a 3%er group and maybe a Boogaloo group, were surrounding the governor's mansion. They were protesting the governor's mansion. And Andy Beshear, who's a Democrat and who's been very focused on public health. And they got beyond 2 or 3 layers of protection around the mansion and were on the front porch of the mansion where they could actually look in the windows. And, they weren't thrown to the ground. They weren't arrested. It's a really, it's a jarring thing to witness. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say on that point, the Second Amendment, I think most Americans are in favor of the general Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment doesn't supersede the First, right? You can't go, if you're going into the street with a weapon, that's not protest. Those are threats of violence.
Linda has a great question here, Linda Kabulian. Please say more about the right-wing groups providing security at Trump rallies. Is this sanctioned by the campaign? I haven't seen this covered in the press, but this seems similar to Praetorian Guard. Jaclyn and I have a piece coming out on this. Do you want to say a little bit about this?
Sure. I can't say whether it's directly overtly sanctioned by Trump, but on the Oath Keepers website, for instance, they have calls for fellow patriots to come together to provide defense for not necessarily Trump, because they say, the law enforcement will protect Trump and will protect the people that he's with, but that will protect protesters. And so they have kind of anecdotal stories on these articles on their website that talk about Trump protesters being beaten and assaulted. Specifically, they say that Antifa comes, which, you know, that Antifa comes and assaults various protesters. So they need people to come and protect them. And they call on the 3%ers explicitly. They call on other militia groups. They call on any patriots, and they also call on individuals with military and law enforcement training. So one of the interesting things about, you know, the Oath Keepers in particular is that a lot of the members are either current or former law enforcement. So they, you know, if they have training to come and kind of protect protesters, they're being called to do this. So specifically to walk them back to their cars late at night and things of that nature. And pretty much every protest, or every Trump speech, it became regularized that the Oath Keepers would put out a call for people to come. They would coordinate. Sort of one interesting aside that I'll say about this, which is not necessarily related to, the Trump campaign protests themselves. The Oath Keepers had a Discord channel that was banned by the platform a few days ago. So within kind of the beginning of June. And so I'm not sure sort of what organization was taking place on that, but whatever it was deemed by the Discord people to be unacceptable, which is kind of, I think, an interesting thing and an important thing to sort of think about and talk about too.
Mm-hmm. We have one more quick question. The question, I'm going to try to summarize it really quick. It's from an anonymous reader or participant here. If there's a correlation between violence on the far right and the far left. So I think the question is getting at, you know, is one type of violence more greater than the other? So right now, is the extreme right more violent than the extreme left? Joe, do you want to take that one, or Lucas?
I guess I'm the one unmuted. So I would have to preface anything I say by that I'm not the expert here on when it comes to violent groups, but I would say that I think any kind of attempt to draw a equivalency between far right violence and far left violence in our society is totally untenable. And if you look at the numbers, far right violence is by far a much greater problem than far left violence, and for that matter, Islamic terrorism. So I think it's not even something that should be in the same conversation.
So I want to do a quick lightning round because we have 2 minutes. What should we be on the lookout for in terms of the globalization and hate in the next 3 months? I'll start with Joe, Jaclyn, and Lucas, you can close up. Joe?
I think, well, the first thing I want to say just quickly, what Lucas was talking about, which is, you know, certainly the far right is more violent right now, and the left had been more violent in the 60s, so we can't give the left a free pass, but certainly right now they're not equivalent. I mean, I think what we should be looking forward, you know, extremism to me often creates a reaction to it, and so we are seeing far right violence right now, but if the left decides that this is the appropriate response, it could be a troubling kind of tit for tat types of violence.
Mm-hmm. Jaclyn, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Lucas and Joe were both saying. I also think that it's really important to think about how events, not just with COVID, but continue to play out. If we see a relapse, if we see sort of people once again being out of work, and sort of the way in which that might change the dynamic, as well as we have overwhelming, you know, popular support right now for Black Lives Matter. But will the institution sort of react angrily against that, and kind of what might change over time there? So I think just it's really important to kind of continually be thinking about how all of these things interplay together.
Great. And Lucas, do you want to have our final answer?
Could you
here?
repeat, is it just what in the next 3 months in terms of far right we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, what's on your radar or that you're thinking about in the next month?
So some of the things that have been going on recently that were extremely troubling. So like this in the clearing of the area in front of the White House for the photo op and this appearance of sort of unmarked coercive forces in the streets that are not identifying themselves. To me, obviously, police violence has been and will continue to be a problem until we make some major structural changes in our society. But to me, those two incidents stood out because when I think about what's almost everyone who's a scholar of fascism has hesitated to refer to what's happening in the US as being sort of fascism in the true sense. But if you get to the point of using sort of paramilitary forces or using violence for like political purpose and spectacle, then we're moving much toward that end of the spectrum. And so things like that are very much on my radar at the moment.
So I want to thank all of you for being here today. It was so lovely to see you. I'm used to seeing you in the halls of SIS and I missed that. It's lovely to see you here. And I thank you also for answering these questions and doing some questions I didn't tell you about in advance. I also want to thank very much the attendees for coming and keep a lookout. We're doing more of these all through the summer. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.